Okay, fantastic. So I thought of you because of your just first familiarity with John. You're one of the first people that he started recording podcasts with. You've been in a lot of the kind of reviews after some of his bigger projects, and you do podcasting, and you have all this experience with language and wisdom and that world. So I thought you had that kind of unique perspective to bring. So do you have any questions about any of the project part stuff before we get into questions themselves?
No, I mean, I have some curiosities, but I think I'll probably just pick it up as we go along. And later in the more open segment, I might ask you a few things.
Okay, great. So question number one, who is John Vervaeke and what does he mean to you?
Oh, wow. John Vervaeke is, first of all, a very fun, beautiful, appreciative human being who is an embodied thinker, which I love, and is somebody who is standing between a lot of different communities, trying to figure out how the best leading edge insights from neuroscience and cognition can underwrite the history of philosophy and spiritual practice in a way that draws upon people from a lot of these leading edge discourse communities that are, the liminal web is a term for them I'm hearing lately, because all of these people have a shared sense of the cultural shift that needs to take place. And John's a guy who, based on his insights into how cognitive science explains and justifies and can draw from spirituality and philosophy, he sees the role that all of that would have to play in correcting any of the major problems we're facing. And that the major problems we're facing are numerous, but there's a kind of a choke point, right? It's somewhere around education and the meaning crisis. And how do you educate people in a way that they can live more rich, diverse, meaningful lives where they can get all of the benefits that sages and philosophers and wisdom teachers have pointed to throughout history in a way that works really well with our contemporary and emerging understandings of science. So I see him as a pivotal figure because trying to say pivotal, not pitiable. The reason that's so essential is that all of those traditions, as glorious as they were, have not fundamentally transformed the whole human civilization. They've all been too specific. So it has to be done in a way that speaks the language of science and can draw from emerging scientific discoveries as well as from all those beautiful practices and experiences. And if we can do that, then there's at least a possibility that it can spread through the civilization. Otherwise, it's always going to be located in these small little lineages and individuals, which is not enough to make the world better. So he's a prophetic figure potentially in that sense.
Excellent. So I'm going to jump to question number 8 because you brought it up. So question number 8, is there a meaning crisis? What is real about it in your life or in the lives of your friends or in the social cultural world at large?
There is a meaning crisis. It's been brewing for a long time. Nietzsche was poking at it 150 years ago, had different names, but there's a sense in which we are all suffering the lack of our collective ability to make sufficient meaning for ourselves, personally, socially, and especially at the planetary scale. We don't know how to live in the world that we're in right now, that seems to be the world, in a way where our neurochemical activators are turned on the right way, the way that religions and communities used to be able to give us. We seem to have lost a lot of that in the transition into modernity. We're looking at an accumulating sense of crises that are coming out of not just modernity, but out of the history of what they call game A. But modernity has certainly amplified it. And so we're facing this huge sense that massive shifts are going on at a huge scale, and we don't know how to grapple with that. And that's part of the meaning crisis, is we just don't know what's going to happen or how we should be behaving. There's a huge vacuum of understanding. And there's a real sense, you can see it in the news every day, that people don't feel confident, don't know how to make identity, don't know what team they're on, and that the social fabric is shredding. And it's not that it's something is necessarily causing it to shred, although there are things like that, social algorithms amplify shredding. But the main thing is that the features that we've always used to prevent shredding are not being implemented, right? We're not building a shared identity in some way that could counterbalance the natural fragmentation that always goes on. So, and all of that stands at the gate of facing any of our practical problems, because if we don't feel good enough, if we don't feel worth fighting for, if we don't feel like we can engage, we don't feel like we can collaborate, we don't feel like our actions are going to make change, we don't feel like if we get together with people, we're going to be clear enough and motivated enough to actually do anything, then none of our problems, which are very big and very real, are going to get solved at all. So the meaning crisis is real, and it stands at the gate to all of the rest of the meta crisis.
Do you see any hierarchy? This is just kind of a pointed follow-up question. Do you see any hierarchy in the motivational aspect or in some of the other aspects that if the meaning crisis was solved, it would open up our energies to do, or our attention or our efforts to do more and address these other crises?
Oh, absolutely. I'm not sure I would call it a hierarchy, but there's a prioritization in a sense, right? That all of the other challenges are waiting upon people having enough extra, in my terms, extra clarity, extra coherence, extra motivation, because you have to have something in you personally and collectively that exceeds the expenditures of your energy that you're making in regular life. Right, there's a certain kind of economy of meaning that we're all stuck in. We have the amount of meaning we have, and we have all the things we have to do, and they balance each other out. In order to do anything else, which also means in order to implement any of the changes we know we should implement to fix these problems, we would need to have a little extra. Now, you can look at the meaning crisis and say we had some meaning and it was taken away, or maybe we have the same amount of meaning and it's just not enough to do the things we need to do. So we've got to get more of whatever that thing is. Otherwise, we're not going to implement any of the feasible approaches that we have to make the world potentially a better place.
Excellent. And another follow-up question, are there ways that you're thriving or see others thriving now? What are you or they doing differently, if so?
The people who are handling it best, in my opinion, have a number of features. One of those features is they're open to the emotional angst of the moment. They're willing to be disturbed by it. They're willing to undergo cognitive dissonance. And that's already downstream of having a certain confidence, a certain faithfulness that says, hey, you could go through that and it wouldn't destroy you. You might actually get something from it. So there's a trust that's been built up. In my view, that trust comes from sets of practices, socially or personally, that bring together a number of different subsystems so that you get an effect that's greater than the sum of the parts. So the people that I see thriving are people who in their relationships and in their individual subjective practice are doing things that bring several dimensions of their life together and harmonize to create a little bit of extra meaningfulness. And a lot of that is just, it could be as simple as looking at the old-fashioned life pie thing, right? But there's some kind of mandala of the different elements of your life, and they have to cross-pollinate each other, not just be switched from one to the other, but actually kind of merge or harmonize or be orchestrated, as John likes to think in kind of resonant acoustic terms a lot of the times. So there's a certain kind of resonant locking together of these different areas. Right. And a lot of that's found in classic spiritual practices as well, right? You can, if you're breathing and watching your thoughts, then you have a somatic experience and a mental experience, and those can merge together at certain points. And it gives you this sense of really being present and really being okay, no matter what's going on. And then you can start to act from out of that extra okayness. So that's one part of it. But I would say that A really rich appreciation and experience of ecology and nature is holding a lot of people together now. I think a commitment to their personal relationships, in terms of discourse, in terms of being open, in terms of expressing appreciation, in terms of being able to access their emotional vulnerability, also in terms of their sexuality and their cooperativeness and the struggle to have a more egalitarian participatory set of relationships. I think that's really interesting work, and it really turns a lot of people on to a feeling that life can be a lot better. And also the way you choose your information sources is huge, right? The sense-making crisis is a real part of what the meaning crisis is. And there's a double side to that. The one side is, how do you get the incoming information that isn't as diluting? And the other one is, how do you receive information so that you're not as diluted? So I think all the people I see thriving they have some strategy for handling incoming cultural information that refines it and upgrades it. And I also think there's a set of perception skills which can go along with, the way John thinks about cognitive systems. But there's something we do with perception that can make it more salient and more enriching, as if we're feeding on a higher quality of perception. And that helps organize us. And it also helps, I think, align us with value. And that's something I haven't said yet exactly, but value is a real experience, a real phenomenon that we can have. And we don't have to be passive in the face of value, right? It's like, there's a very interesting emerging neuroscience around the old practices of gratitude, where you find something that's valuable in your life, that's appreciable for you, and you perceive it and you hold that, you extend that, you deepen that, you allow your systems to coordinate around that experience more richly. And then your system is better at finding and holding value. And so down the line, it feels more valuable to you than it might otherwise have felt if you're just passively waiting for situations to provoke value feelings or not. There's probably more, but I'm sure that's enough.
No, that's an amazing answer. And this morning I was practicing savoring, which John teaches in one of his courses, and I was just trying to bottom up appreciate the beach and the sunrise and whatever I noticed, really the smells even. And that was interesting that you said that, like, there's this second order kind of like almost unconscious feedback system happening, that as you started tuning to the good things that you're savoring, it would help you long term as well, not even just like in that moment. So excellent. So I'll jump back up a little bit to the earlier question. So question number 2, what are the 4 ways of knowing, and why are they an improvement on how most educators teach about the mind and human knowledge?
Yeah. And I connect the 4 ways of knowing to the quadrants, the integral theory, because I'm very versed in the Ken Wilber approach as well. Right. But they're not identical, but there's certainly a similarity there, right? Because there's kind of way of knowing as a perceiver. There's just how things are showing up for me, almost phenomenologically. I'm looking at the world as something. And then there's a way of knowing in terms of knowing about things, a propositional form of knowledge, right? I'm going to wonder about that thing, kind of a third person perspective to gaining information, which has, and for many good reasons, predominated in the scientific discourse over the last few hundred years, but which is insufficient to describe the richness of our experience, and certainly has a hard time getting to imaginal and moral aspects of our experience. But there's also participatory experience, which is that you can often, with other people, shift into modes of experience that are relative to certain contexts and certain ways of behaving. And that these are, when I talk about post-metaphysical spirituality, one of the key elements is that you don't have to necessarily agree with a set of propositions about the universe, right? It's not about the beliefs. You can still do these practices and have these experiences, whether you believe these propositions about reality or not. So you could be, from the point of view of participation, there's a fundamental agnosticism about the propositional universe. And that's really empowering, because there's a lot of experience that could inform our worldview that we don't have because of the worldview we already are locked into. I think Whitehead said that if you're trying to make a map of reality just from the point of view of an adult, waking, sane human being who's sober in our civilization, you're getting a very small slice of the experiences that you have to turn into an intelligible map of reality. So in order to sample reality broadly, you have to participate in these things, whether you think they're true or not, gain the experience, and then on the basis of having the experience, try to see what would be a comprehensible and coherent map of the universe. And that's a deeply scientific enterprise. And then there's also process or procedural knowledge, which is how do things come about through certain sets of enactments, right? I think that's a very important one going forward because it's very computational. John's sometimes a little hesitant because computation has a certain meaning in psychology, but the basic notion of computation distinct from, say, algebra is that you're running a program. The processes are unfolding through time and they're producing something that you might not find up front, right? So the strange attractor emerges from the fractal by running it many times. Likewise, the political and social effects we have are often emergent out of the systems we're deploying, right? Is there something about the way we vote that gives us the kinds of outcomes we get? And we're not just choosing among leaders, we're always only getting the kinds of leaders that kind of voting can enact.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah,
So I would say that all four of them are deeply enactive. But when we start thinking of things as dynamic and enactive, you do have to separate them into these different zones to make sure you're not leaving anything out that's part of the real data gathering out of which we make a sensible map of the world.
Excellent. Question number 3. What are the 3 orders? Nomological, normative, and narrative. And how does thinking in these terms help someone live a more intelligible and meaningful life?
Yeah, those, I always want to shy away from those words and
Sure.
something more basic, because there's, I mean, I like the way there's a language of instruction and there's a language of description and there's a general capacity to frame our experience in stories. And for a while, I did a lot of meditation teaching. This is one that always comes up for me because the word emptiness is very useful when you're trying to help somebody get into certain states of consciousness. They can relate to what that might mean. When you sit down philosophically, you can look at it and go, I'm not sure that's even a viable concept, right? I read somewhere in Bergson that absence is not conceivable. Right? What do I mean by emptiness? And then you find the sages and they end up saying, well, yeah, emptiness itself is empty of emptiness. So this is not really the right term. But that's a very different discourse than the discourse in which you're trying to get someone or yourself into an experience, which in turn is very different from a discourse in which you almost artistically and with other people put together a story in which your needs and your possibilities and the well-being of the people and things you care about are at the center of the story. And there's a history of successes and failures in those endeavors, and there's a future to succeeding or failing in those endeavors. But I think we need to be aware that there are these multiple uses of language, and perhaps some really good language for discussing the differences between other languages, but that's currently at the leading edge of what we know about it. Although Zach Stein will tell you that Piaget already had it.
Yeah, I have a lot of advanced degrees in similar topics. I've read Piaget, and he's very inaccessible even to friends when I try to describe his ideas or share some really juicy moments that he, I won't get off topic, but like he has this moment where he talks about children having fantasies and how they treat them as magical and how he kind of unpacks some of that and how they hide it from adults. And it's just so interesting to think about the mind in those terms, but then it's really hard for a lot of people to even get to the level where they might appreciate some of what he's talking about. Which I guess will segue into question number 4. What are any barriers to appreciating, understanding, or applying ideas from John's work?
John has to walk a very fine line because he's between these very far out discussion communities, the academic institution, the sober history of the disciplines that he's in, and his deep love for practice and spirituality. So he can't do any of them too much. And I think that the barriers for some people are very often when they come in and they think he's doing more of one than the other. And that's often not the case because he's very good at walking this line. But if I talk to a guy who has a very dedicated, strong background in thinking about God, for example, he might listen to John and go, this is good. I like this guy, but it's too materialistic. And that's inherently going to be reductive. And as great as it is, it's leaving out the reality of the spirit. And then the next person is going to come in and go, it sounds like smart, leading edge cognitive science, but I don't know, man, it sounds like it's swaying too far into religion. And I think that's not true. I think both of those people could have a little richer, further experience and get over that hurdle. But I think there's often a hurdle for people in terms of him being so diverse and balanced that you often think he's leaning in too far in a direction because it's the opposite direction of the one you're used to working on. Does that make any sense?
A lot of sense. Yeah, I was listening to Alan Watts talk about kind of a similar topic and how some people are just really hard to describe or to think about, maybe for their creativity or for their genius, one might argue. But
I think when you have a certain universality, it's very easy for any group or genre of social endeavor to mistake you for their rival.
We've talked about that in these meetings. Yeah. Do you have any way that you think, especially a team could frame him better, or he could frame himself better to kind of overcome that gap to a higher degree?
I think being very upfront about the fact that he, like everyone, is a multiplicity, right? That kind of Walt Whitman thing of containing multitudes, right? If you lead with that, then people aren't going to be put off by seeing that there are these differences. I think making a virtue out of multiplicity and to some degree being protean, to being a shapeshifter, make that sound like a virtue, and then people will respect it when they see it.
Excellent. So next question, you've already touched on a little bit. What does he mean by cultural cognitive grammar? And then are there any tools or resources that you could imagine helpful to yourself or someone else in this respect? Just appreciate that part of his work.
I don't know. I'm in a lot of conversations with him where it feels like that's the thing that's still being generated. I'm not sure there's a toolkit there that's of use necessarily yet, but I think there's an opening, a clearing for discovery, for working with him on figuring those things out. I think the insights into how cognition functions in an almost computational way inside biological and neurobiological systems does afford us a lot of opportunity to rethink how cultures are arranged. And right, there's a culture-like element to cognitive processes, and there's a potential effect on cultural systems by taking advantage of the ways those cognitive processes have succeeded. And there's there'll be a set of terms and ideas that empower us to be able to try that. My sense is we're still, and even he is still early in the process of articulating what those concepts might be.
Excellent. What does he mean by ecology of practices? And then do you have any practices that you do daily, weekly, et cetera, or wish that you did?
Yeah, in ecology, I mean, every religious tradition, especially if it has an esoteric component, has an ecology of practices, that it's evolved or gathered together a set of things that are recommended. Not everybody uses all of them, right? So there's a Buddhist and many Buddhist ecologies of practice. There's, a Sufi ecology of practice. There's ceremonial magicians have certain practices that they've gathered together. They change a little bit over time. So there's an idea that many people have done this work over time, and we can now make a kind of meta ecology of practices, which we're just calling the ecology of practices, but nonetheless, it's drawing on all these sources and wondering where they overlap, where they might be the same, where you might be able to add something new to them based on a more structural and dynamic look at how these systems operate in us? Could we be able to, if we understood the basic principles, could we improvise new practices to add to the ecology? And then it becomes a sort of, like the App Store, right? You can look for what you need in that system. It's available to everybody to take advantage of the collective wisdom heritage vetted by neurobiological and cognitive science. So, because they're not all going to work, but there's a lot of great stuff there. And then you also end up with the study of how these different, how do they interact and what are the underlying principles? That's a lot of my own work. And when you're trying to do, as John does, think about the religion that is not a religion, what are the basic sets of practices that would have to have? You were thinking very generically about the kind of practice that either traditions or secular people or idiosyncratic religious individuals could all draw on something collectively. What would that collection look like? And how do the parts of that collection, I mean, it's not just a bunch of things on a shelf, right? They're more organic. They interact with each other. There's a complexity there, which makes the word ecology more apt than just a bag of them. In my own life, I mean, my life is largely about those things. So I invent and use and draw on practices a lot. I have many that I've tried, some that I've made up. I have some arguments about what practices have in common and why they work. I also have the ones I regularly do that over time have become my necessary practices. And some of those are, some of those look more like practices than others, right? Because you might say, well, getting into a really good conversation with somebody, whether it's an intimate partner or somebody through Zoom, yeah, that's a very important practice. That's exceptionally important. That's borderline religious, but it doesn't quite look the way it looks when you sit down with your eyes closed and somebody would walk by and go, oh, he's doing one of his inner practices. For me, physical yoga and muscle exercise is important. You got to maintain, and that's got two parts, right? There's all the stuff we now know about why the body needs those exercises, both for flexibility and for outputting the right kind of hormones into your system. But that's also an opportunity to bring multiple subsystems together, right? If you can have a mental and emotional component, so you're making efforts in your mind and you're making efforts with your heart at the same time you're making efforts with your body, then a simple exercise routine becomes a more spiritual routine. Usually when I get up, I'll do something like a concentration or a mantra exercise to the point where I feel, I usually think of my mind stabilizing or turning on. But essentially, a lot of people find this when they wake up in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning. It's the worst moment because your attention just goes to all the worst unsolved things. Right. So I don't want to get out of bed until I've fixed that problem. So some kind of intentional focusing procedure is used. Right. I often use a mantra. Sometimes I use counting because I want to see how many repetitions it actually takes to achieve what level of effect. But once I've achieved an internal mental coherence that's adequate to stop my attention from arbitrarily going after stressful, unresolved things, then I'm ready to get up. Then I'll do the kind of physical practices I mentioned, but also just basic health practices. And you gotta set your circadian rhythm by looking at the outdoor light. There's all these very interesting things that are relatively stable emergent discoveries from contemporary neuroscience that we should all be using a little bit. In the afternoons, I'll usually do an insight practice. And this is really, in Buddhism, there's, sort of concentration practice. So then there's a sort of self-inquiry or self-deconstruction practice. That one's much more flexible to me because I always have a new thought about how to do the inquiry. It's like, it's weaponizing a kind of questioning of the self, right? So there's the classic ways to do that is, is whatever's coming up actually made of a bunch of parts? Is it temporary? Did it arise? Will it pass away? That's the old Siddhartha Gautama phrasing of how to do that. But you could also ask of each situation and thing that comes up, why am I not in a flow state under those conditions? Why am I thinking of a thing that isn't a flow state? What is it? What do I not see about that situation? Or how am I overlaying narrative opposites here, right? Why do I assume that like, how do I make this more clear? I feel like I got to work in the yard. It's like a whole bunch of snow to shovel. We got a big snowfall last night. Now, part of me is like, I got to do this thing. Another part of me is like, well, what if I didn't do that thing? Then I would be off the hook. And like, why do those seem like opposites, right? Why does the freedom part seem like the opposite of the creative action part? And there's a big scale version of that, which is like, why does manifest universe seem like it's different than eternal freedom and emptiness? And they can't be different. So I'm looking at something, I'm looking at each situation and going, oh, maybe there's a structural framing there that's incorrect and keeping it right. So I'm just doing examples of different kinds of self-inquiry processes that are part of my daily routine. Also, being with nature, both as a sensory experience and as a contemplation experience, where I try to do enriched perception eating, which has, I think, changed very much over the course of my life. But the fact that I do something like that has been very consistent and increasingly more valuable to me over time. And one of the main things I do there that's peculiar is, do you know Eugene Genlin's notion of focusing? Yeah. So there's a sense in which there's a felt sense that you're trying to languish. You're trying to come up with something that locks, and you'll feel it lock together. And you can do that with a lot of things, where you go, oh, when something catches your attention, like, oh, look at the way the snow's falling over there. I don't even know exactly what it is. It's right at the leading edge. It's on the tongue tip of my cognitive capacity to language that, but I'm resonating with it. And then I look for something that in this moment could lock that in, even if it makes no sense to me. It has to be a resonant lock. And then what you're doing there is bringing two different functional systems together, right? One system is doing the perceiving, and another system, which you currently don't know about, is going to do this other naming part. And when they lock together, they've touched and synchronized. So when I conceive of it, all of the practices are practices of basically synchronizing or integrating systems that would otherwise be apart. And in yourself, that's different subjective systems, but it's also pretty much the same pattern when it's between people or between genres of social activity.
Wow, excellent. What is something you wish John would talk more about, especially related to the meaning crisis, ecology practices, or cultural cognitive grammar?
I think it would be nice if he felt comfortable broaching the political dimension of our lives in a more robust way. He and I had a conversation about it, very abstract. And I know it's a rough thing within the institutions to stake out a position on that. But I think we're collectively at a point where, that Cornell West thing has to happen. There has to be a very strong moral political connection in one's communication. And also I would like to hear him talk more about how we face doom together, right? Whether that's facing it to overcome it or facing it to go through it more gracefully. What is that like in our machinery? He and Chris did that book on zombies. That's great. And there's something similar in there, right? There's dark peak experiences, and there's like an inverse version of letting go of normal life. There's a way he has that's really good of appreciating what seems like the opposite of positive experiences. There's a very similar kinds of salience machinery involved in, say, appreciating the wondrous goodness of the universe and really wanting to see how mangled people got in that car accident. And that shadow work element, I guess, of going into the dark versions of these things. How do you do that more profitably, more successfully, more reliably? Because that's important not just for our psychological health as individuals, but for how we collectively face very difficult and disruptive things that are beginning to happen.
Yeah, I know people talk about dignity, dying with dignity, dealing with death, and those kind of things. That's excellent.
Yeah, how do we have a climate crisis with dignity?
Right. Yeah, exactly. How do we? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Even if you're really interested in John and his work and you get it, what do you think would help other people get more out of the things he talks about, his series, or just anything else?
Yeah, that's tricky because a lot of that is just going to be them spending time with him and putting in the work to pay attention to it, right? And that's, you can't just glance through the meaning crisis. You got to sit down and watch it, probably watch it again in order to go, oh, nice, right? So a lot of it's on the recipient of the information. So if they were encouraged or it was framed in the right way that they were going to have to do some work, it wasn't going to be immediately accessible to them, that's probably important. But I saw in that email you sent, you mentioned there, animators and things like that. There might be ways of visually presenting, like if you were to animate a conversation and try to show visually how Dialogos is acting between two interlocutors, that would be very interesting, right? If you were to be able to show or overlay, when like John likes to talk about the scientists working with the rovers and how they projectively get involved. And that's very similar to the way a shaman becomes the deer or becomes the jaguar, right? And we have these old cave paintings of these moments of becoming an animal, right? To be able to show different versions of the same phenomenon, to be able to show one that looks scientific and technological and one that looks spiritual and classical and one that looks aboriginal and archaic. That would be a really interesting way, because I think John is able to see similarities of patterns in many areas. And often when people are hearing him, they're only thinking of one thing. But if you can show them several different things that exhibit the same pattern, you're getting closer to how he sees it. And so it's a way in for them to his insight.
Yeah, that's excellent. I've actually transcribed a few of his trialogues and dialogues and tried to see how is the meaning emerging across the people, and are there little hints early that might kind of show things later. And it really is interesting how that kind of stuff might work. Excellent. So
there's one other thing, actually. I mean, because he's recorded so many things now, and there's so much in each one, right? So you have a stack of things, then you have another stack of things, another stack of things. There's a cross section that might be useful to people, right? Like one of the things that I like most about John is how focused he is on being appreciative, right? And that's something that you see at certain moments in almost every conversation, and certainly at the beginning. And if you were to run a lot of those together, right? Here he is being impressed by someone else's idea 10 times. Here he is trying to make this point 10 times in 10 different ways to 10 different people. Then a person could go, oh, that's a different slicing, right? Rather than seeing all of one conversation together, you could show similar bits of a bunch of conversations. And then the features of the insight and the temperament that he brings in might stand out in that way.
I've tried to do that to varying degrees of success, and it's hard to montage really high level conversations that get very nuanced within the conversation, and then trying to portray an intelligible picture between such high level moments. But yeah, that's excellent. That I'm sure will give people a lot of ideas. Are there any celebrities, podcasts, figures from literature, music, or art from modern times that John reminds you of?
Specifically from modern times.
Well, feel free to open it up too if you feel like you have something that maybe would fit a little better. But
yeah, I don't know. I mean, he's a very Socratic figure for me. I think even visually, I can see him walking around Athens in a toga.
What makes him Socratic, do you think?
I think it's a combination of wanting to approach knowledge through curiosity and questioning and dialogue, and emotionally attuning to virtue and function as the framing, right? Because a lot of, if you read in Plato, Socrates always goes to the carpenter and he wants to know, like, explain to me why carpentry works. Like, what's awesome about carpentry? How do you do it right? And the guy says something and it's not right. And so he has to ask and ask and ask until they get into an intersubjective groove together. But so he's focused on this intersubjective grooving effect as the source of wisdom, but it's oriented or framed around the attempt to find resonant functional virtue qualities. Right. So I think that's what Socrates does, and I think that's what John does as well.
Are there any people from those same places or parts of history that are the complete opposite of John or what he represents?
That's a really interesting question. Who is the anti-John? Did you ever see the movie version of Umberto Eco's book, The Name of the Rose? It was in early 80s, had Sean Connery and young Christian Slater.
I know what you're talking about. I can see it in my mind. I have not watched the complete thing. If I have, it's been like 20 years. Yeah.
So the villain in that story is the old blind monk who doesn't want anybody to read Aristotle's book on humor. But because it's Aristotle's book, he won't destroy it, but he's killing people who've read it because it undermines the sobriety of what they think the church and the institution and their wisdom project is, right? So he's a blind, he's effacing humor and the human experience in his attempt to secure wisdom production. And I think that's the opposite of John. John's trying to fold in human experience to wisdom production.
Excellent. Do you have any activities that have expanded your vocabulary in the last 1 to 5 years or regularly, including language learning, reading, for personal reasons, public speaking? Do you enjoy it or think it adds value to your life, any of these pursuits?
Talking with smart people is always, every conversation you hear at least one word that sticks. For me, audiobooks, I barely read with my eyes anymore because I can, if I'm walking or hiking or driving or mowing the lawn or something, I can get my reading done then. And almost every book has one thing I just finished The Dawn of Everything, this Graeber and Wengrow history book that everybody's into. We did a discussion about it yesterday, but they talked about schismogenesis as a feature in cultural history. And I'm like, schismogenesis? That's just fun to say. I better. The whole book, that's what I took away, was the word schismogenesis. I think just feeling liberated to play with language is a major feature. And I think if that was in your household, then you probably approach everything in your life with the freedom to pick up words that are interesting, find out about them and use them, rather than thinking of them as some weird foreign phenomenon. But if you hear something you don't know, look it up. It only takes a second.
Excellent. We've already talked about these a little bit. This one's okay. How important is community, friendship, or other pro-social activities? How you've talked about this a little bit, but if you have anything else to add, how often and in what way do you participate in these activities on a regular basis?
Yeah, there's like 3 different parts of me. There's a certain type of people who engage in certain conversations, have a certain kind of emotional openness that I find. And I want to talk to them as much as possible all the time by whatever means possible. And most of those means are through these machines in front of us because they don't all live down the street from me. A couple of them do. And I focus into that. On the other hand, I draw back from what I think is relatively trivial socializing as much as possible, right? If there's, holiday dinners 5 times a year, I'll go to one of them. I don't want to use up my social time in ways that aren't very enriching and fulfilling just because I have a drive to be sociable. I want to skew that drive toward the experiences with people that I find really enriching as much as possible. So that's personal. And then there's a sort of civic sensibility, which is, I think, the way you approach a random member of your society, which should always be with a kind of joy and respect. You're always, you have to, everybody, you got to give each other the nod to show that you're doing the serious play of pretending that there is a civilization here. And that's a very ennobling thing. It creates part of that civic wisdom spirit that was in Athens, or, I think Kierkegaard was like that in Denmark. I just imagine him running into people on the streets, trying to make them feel like they are ennobled by being part of the shared field. And that's connected to broader ideas, intellectual ideas about how society functions, how something like religion can form. I pay a lot of attention to certain elements of politics and news and certain kinds of discussions I like to be in with people around that stuff, because I think, so I'm saying there's like civic socializing and personal socializing, and there's also the grappling with the social dimension, which is really tied in with that, and I think is equally as important as having the in-person exchanges with people.
Yeah, it's excellent. John talks about stoicism, and I know people respond a lot to that kind of stoic joy and stoic sense of participation with culture at some of the levels that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Excellent. What are one or two salient things that John taught you about being wiser, aspiring, character, loving others, or the meaning of life?
Well, I've touched on this before, but I think that the way he deploys appreciativeness at the beginning of a discussion facilitates the likelihood that dialogos is going to take on a life of its own in that discussion. And as a guy who does a lot of conversations, I frequently think of John doing that. And when I do, it reminds me to try to start every discussion with some kind of gesture of praise, which changes my chemistry and makes a different kind of invitation, and also sets the frame for the other person to also be more likely to be in a mood of praise, so that we can be together towards something that we think is great. But also a lot of his words are sticky, right? It's hard to not start saying affords all the time.
Excellent. Yeah.
And optimal grip, right? So I mean, it's similar to a lot of things I've been thinking before, which is why I had a spot for it to stick. But so I go, oh yeah, exactly. It's gotta be like that. They're counterbalancing each other to find the local maximum. Yeah, okay. And when we get that idea, then it really, I don't know that it explains everything, but you certainly see it everywhere.
Yeah, nature doesn't want to be wasteful.
Yeah.
Excellent. Do you know what kind of pizza a monk orders?
One with everything.
You got it. That was John's joke in like one of his earliest videos. Awesome. And then these are two fun questions. The last two questions, they're fun. They're just to play with. Question number one: what does John have in common with Taylor Swift?
I've heard of both of them. I was going to say they both turned me on, but I don't know her well enough to know if that's true or not. But it's potentially they both have some sort of cultural allure.
What is different about them?
Well, I know a lot more about one than the other. I think celebrities in general are set up to be in a one-way transmission mode, and John is set up to be in a two-way transmission exchange mode.
Excellent. And then the second question, if John had $1 billion mysteriously donated to his project, what kind of world do you think it would look like if he spent that money?
I think that he would spend some of it, setting up some labs to do some more leading edge cognitive research. So there would be discoveries that change the world coming out of that. But I think he would spend a big chunk of it trying to create some kind of religion-like or interreligious institution, right? The religion that isn't a religion consulting group that could help people start local practices that could go into different kinds of religious settings and help people adaptively skew towards more healthy wisdom practice within that setting. What are they lacking? That kind of thing. I mean, he and I and Brendan have been talking about this recently, that you need to set something up. If you think there's going to be a usefulness for the ecology of wisdom practices, and that it has to happen at the level of the social scale and intergenerational time, then you have to set up an institution or a network of people who at least plausibly can start doing that. You got to get staffed with the right people, and you've got to have procedures that are probably an analogy to the way the cognitive processes work internally, so they can go and adaptively relate to and spread this without taking on the role of a religion or a think tank or something like that, where everybody thinks they already know what it is and it just sits there over time. So I think, and I don't know how much effect it could have, I think he would try to set something like that up. And there's a very strong possibility that it could really enrich the world, given enough time.
Awesome. Yeah, I studied organizational change and organizational behavior and work psychology. And all of the best people I've ever met said it's really, really, really hard to change organizations. And when you start going out to like the education level at a state or a police department or these bigger kind of like we're trying to talk about here levels, it becomes very simple to imagine, but not simple to enact, maybe.
Yeah, and even if you get the agreement to enact it, which is rare,
right?
And it's still an ongoing. I mean, one of the sub-series on the integral stage is about systemic things, right? And I was talking to Brian Robertson, who created Holacracy. If you're familiar with that, right? And he was telling me it's a sort of self-reconfiguring alternative operating system for businesses and groups.
Okay.
Right, where you rather than being a person, you're a role, and you can have multiple roles, and there's
I love that stuff.
that feeds back on itself and this kind of thing, right? So a number of big businesses have started to agree to implement this thing because it's got some cachet. But even when you start, it's still going to be 10 to 20 years, right? If it's IBM or something like that, just saying yes doesn't mean the change happens. It's an ongoing struggle to reformat our instincts about how to make decisions together.
Right, every habit that's been inherited or that lives in the system is fighting against this beautiful new idea.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago, I was, you'd be with people and go, hey, let's go to the movies. Okay. Like, how are we going to make the decision about what movie to see? Should we just talk about it till we achieve a consensus? But what if consensus is actually a low-level collective intelligence protocol? What if we each decided a number on a scale of 1 to 10 for each of the films and then averaged it out, and then we would trust that the larger average was the one that we collectively wanted to see, right? And everyone goes, oh, that's an interesting idea, but I don't want to do that. Doesn't feel natural. Show of hands feels natural, but show of hands is only going to get you so far.
Yeah, one of my best friends moved to New Orleans after making many spreadsheets with his now wife on those things, and they're so happy. But that extra level of effort in the decision making is not something maybe attractive to everybody, or even everyone's capable of.
In the integral theory model, you got these quadrants, and the bottom ones are the collective quadrants. So there's like the interpersonal, and then also the systemic. And so it's very easy for people to think about how we get a better ethos, right? Oh, we should have trust and loving and honesty and integrity, and we should work together. Oh, that's be great. But if we do that, and then when it comes to all of our formal decision making, we use the old system, we're probably still going to get shitty results.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and the interpersonal, intrapersonal. I anecdotally remember when someone that worked with a friend of mine who owned a business hired one staff. Within 6 months, like 80% of the staff had left because this one bad apple, this one person's like new bad attitude just rippled silently through the structure, unbeknownst to even the leadership, essentially. And it's so complicated. Who's self-selecting in, who's staying, what knowledge is leaving when someone leaves. There's just so much happening.
We see so little of that it's hard for us to get an instinct about it. Like, how many transformation attempts would you have to see, and for how long before you had a good sense of how they work? Right. I know if somebody says to me, we should have modern monetary theory implemented, I'm like, okay, but nobody knows. Like, how long would you have to sit back and figure out whether a system change works? And nobody has that, nobody's afforded that opportunity. So we're all kind of shooting in the dark on these things. Although we do have a small number of insights about what tends to make groups smarter or dumber.
Yeah, and the team's research is very siloed in academia, and they don't really know how to talk to the rest of the world. So there's that disconnect a lot of times as well, because there is really good theories on team behaviors, multi-level modeling and things like that, but then getting it like to the pragmatic or
they've got to be, I mean, essentially you have to implement them and allow them to compete and see what would actually work, because we don't know which of the theories will be most successful or not.
Yeah, China has, they let their mayors, I guess, more do kind of wild things as a city, and then they just will get you out if you're bad or let you go up. But then you can implement, electric cars at a citywide level. Or they had a city where they like painted all the parking lots at a mall a weird way to help people park better, which it's hard to do unless you're letting people experiment.
No, we're facing so many collective crises that we have to be trying more options. It's one of the things. Where are you? Are you in Canada? Are you in Toronto down there?
No, I'm in Florida.
You're in Florida.
Yeah, I was in Michigan when I met John, and so I'm back in Florida now.
The obviously, like everywhere, but in Canada, the Aboriginal land rights thing is a big issue, and there's a whole bunch of historical and ethical dimensions to that. But for me, the most exciting thing is, we should have different operational control structures on different regions, right? Let a bunch of different types of people run their regions differently. I mean, require them to meet a minimum set of standards of some kind, but we don't know what's the best way to organize communities and shepherd land and things like that. So we do need to, as a society, endow different groups to try different things.
Yeah, that's actually the in psychology, the mono solution or the mono variable problem is often like a first year kind of freshman mistake. It's like, oh, we'll describe humans in one variable. And then you go, oh, that's actually a really bad way to describe most social phenomenon.
Exactly. So it's got to be much more intersectional in the best meaning of that term. And also at the same time, you have to, and I think this is a key aspect of what wisdom skills is, it's pondering, it's weighing out different plausible scenarios, whether it's in your own hearts or whether it's in systems we're going to set up, or whether it's different perspectival options you have on any situation. Well, it could be, you have to be able to negotiate in that space to find your hybrid options, which is, that's King Solomon. That's the ancient archetype of the wise judge. But that only works when you have multiple competing operational choices.
Right. The top-down Napoleonic model of one decision maker that ripples through these huge things versus the group that locks themselves in a room for 20 days to figure out what's really going on and then leaves the room to come up with a new pope or whatever the decision is.
Yeah, the problem of, there has to be some kind of informational filter to keep distortion out from the outside, but obviously insulating ourselves from the communities and effects of our decisions is a huge problem going on in our current society. And then the hierarchy problem is ancient, right? There's a sense in which as long as there's a person who's above you, whose decisions can positively or negatively affect you, which is also your lives and your loved ones, you can't give that person all the information. You have to tailor it for them, right? Because they are a danger or a reward to you. And then they have the same thing, right? So they have to winnow down the information for their superior. And if you go up a pyramid structure, the guy at the top ends up being the least informed about reality of anyone in the system. And that's very dangerous.
Yeah, the fear of speaking, psychological safety I've written on and done work on, and the power distance, especially like some countries, that the captain is unapproachable to a flight attendant that might have information to save the entire plane, and those kind of situations. Well, this is excellent. I feel like I could ask you 1,000 questions and just keep learning from you and hearing great responses. Did you have anything else that you would want to share with people that would hear this and that might be interested in this project?
Well, I could, I mean, I noticed you didn't ask a question of how did you get involved with John? And that's probably an interesting thing to ask all sorts of people.
Mhm.
Maybe it'll bring up some other things for me, but I'm trying to remember how that actually did happen. Yeah, it was I guess he was invited to the Meta Modern email list, which I was on, even though I didn't read most of the messages most of the time. And I recognized him because I'd seen a video of his a couple years earlier on flow states and chi practices.
Mhm.
And I was very curious to hear, oh, what's the cutting edge analysis of chi practice? I'm involved in that. And it was down the road for me in Toronto because I'm in Ontario as well. And oh, that's interesting. There's a guy down there thinking about that. And then when I saw his name come up on the list, I suddenly had his email address. So I reached out to him because I was involved in putting together this project, a meta-modern anthology, a book being published in England. And we were looking for people to be representatives of a diverse leading edge thinking set. So I just emailed him, and actually I was going to be in Toronto to visit some relatives. I said, I'm coming down. We'd love to have you in the project. And I actually missed him because my flights got mixed up. But we just emailed back and forth and ended up he agreed to be in the book. He was going to give us a piece that he and Chris had written. And he wanted to get some more feedback on what was going on, because I think he was curious about the meta-modernists in general. So we just had a video chat about that, and it went really well. And he wanted to ask me a lot of questions about my spiritual practice. And then it was around the time that he and I were both getting into podcasting. So we started to do those things, and we just had really good experiences with each other, and then progressively have a lot of the same people in common that we talk to. So that's fascinating to me, and just the sense that there really is some kind of community or movement that's emerging, a set of shared inclusions and sensibilities that Game B and Integral and Meta Modern and the Liminal Web and the Stoa, right? A lot of these people are in a lot of those spaces and appreciating a lot of the same people. And when you're just looking at one little corner of it, you just know a bit of it, it would be strange to think it's real. Maybe these are just your preferences. But when you start to see it all over, you go, oh, actually, a lot of people are in this same spot. They want to have real existential transformation. They want society to be wiser and more virtuous. They want to be able to affirm classical practices, but they also want it to be consonant with cutting edge science. And they want to have a sensibility that's informed by contemporary concerns and pluralistic postmodern thought, but not locked into that in a way that disadvantages us. And then there turns out to be many people like that. And when you hang out with them, there's a real positive sense that this could change things, or at least be super rewarding for us while society collapses.
I've had that exact pointedness with John. He said, like, well, I'll either be very happy or things will work out. And that is a very common, because you have to go at some point, maybe it won't work out. And then you have to come to the decision that it's worth it anyways, to keep trying and just to enjoy it while you're there. And I've participated a lot in the Stoa sessions and have seen firsthand all of the different people who are secretly interested in the same things and espousing the same kind of general things, and just really mean it, and they want it, and they're highly motivated. A lot of them, they're deep people. They're great parts of society. It's not like these outcasts and this fringe movement that you might have seen in the 60s or in different periods of time. Or so it's really just it's interesting. I'm very skeptical of kind of new age movements in general.
Yeah.
And I have none of those feelings whenever I'm participating in any of these kind of things. It's very,
Yeah, I think that's true. There's a certain, I mean, any community you're going to find some people that you like that are impressive, but there's a tremendous intelligence and I think health and decency and sensibility in these communities. And people are very, I mean, like full spectrum people, right? Regardless of what they're doing, they're aware that that emotion and somatics and thoughts and vision and altered states and all of these things, we're going to need science, we're going to need sexuality, we're going to need diet, we're going to need all these things together. And they're the people in this community have an incredible ability to create a coherence out of those things. Right? Different people do it in different degrees, but everybody's kind of doing it. It's almost like you hear the buzzing, which it's just so gratifying. And yeah, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but we all die anyway. So we're always in that position.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think 100%. So yeah, let me just, do you have any thoughts on any of the like more history of Buddhism or more Neoplatonism, or is like Heidegger too cryptic for people? Like some of those thinkers that surround John or movements. Like I love Neoplatonism. I've talked with John and Arthur versus Lewis, and the more I read about Neoplatonism, the more interesting it is. Also very alien to like how everyone talks. So it's a weird kind of intellectual space that people are getting excited about. So I guess, do you have any thoughts about any of that stuff?
Well, I mean, one of the best experiences is to hear some exciting thing about a philosopher who sounds a little daunting to you. And so I think it's good for people to go, oh my God, Heidegger. And you're like, you're just not sure. Or Hegel, you're like, I don't know. I probably haven't read enough Hegel or haven't read enough Plotinus. So one of the things I love about these discourses is things are always coming up that make me go, oh, I should probably look into that more.
That's great, because you look at it as not like a barrier, but as an opportunity.
Yeah, like we have a certain, I mean, I think it's partly the sensibility of the consumer culture, which is everything's supposed to be immediately intelligible and likable up front in the advertising. And that's not really how life works. Like if you're out in the, if you look at the berry bush, you're like, oh, there's some berries and some thorns there. And I would have to climb up a little to get those berries. Like that's a normal, natural way of approaching something that looks interesting for human beings. It's often a little daunting or a little mysterious or a little cryptic, or, if we think about the people who are most meaningful in our lives, often we were skeptical or confused by them at first. Right. So it's not a negative sign that people hear something and go, I don't know what that means. So that's an opportunity.
Yeah, I like thinking graphically, and the idea that you have to go down a little bit to get out of that local maximum and do uncomfortable things. And then Byung-Chul Han talks about like the tyranny of the smooth and the attraction of smoothness, and those kind of things it is good to be uncomfortable sometimes. It's almost like your practices and can be a refuge that let you go into those uncomfortable places.
Yeah, and if you're not, I mean, you're unlikely to get a lot out of it if you can't shift into that mode fluidly. So that's a skill building opportunity.
Yeah, exploring new territory is I love going places without GPS and just kind of seeing if I can get there, and then if not, like, and I'm not in a hurry, just learning a little bit by getting lost and then getting there anyways.
Absolutely. Your visceral neurological mapping functions come online when you give them something they need. There's a very interesting set of studies on what would happen if we gave kids the final exam on the first day of class. Right. So of course they're not going to successfully answer all the questions, but it turns out at the end of the class, at the end of the semester, they give better answers. They're more complete, more successful, because when they first saw this and stressed about it, their brain sends out a bunch of fingers going, oh, I need answers. I need something for this. I need something for this. And then they have that availability. And, I don't know if you know the Wim Hof breathing stuff, but there's a similar thing when you put yourself in that anaerobic distress. And one of the things it does is make you hungrier to really assimilate oxygen, right? You can make yourself, you generate the hunger, generate the thirst, and then something can come in more deeply.
Yeah, the cognitive science studies, I know some of what you're talking about. I've studied a bunch of with cognitive people, and the idea that it grabs your attention when you're wrong, and then it primes you almost to learn from those mistakes, that confronting early with practice problems that you fail at, even just appreciating errors is, I think, something
Yeah.
people have lost. Like, errors are ubiquitous, systematic, interconnected, and if you could sit with them a long time, you can really kind of start to make some connections or build skills that are um, the opposite of avoiding problems your whole life, or avoiding those 10 hours of studying to do something, or
I think we're seeing, I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about this time is the last, say, 20 years, there's been a lot of good philosophers and good science suggesting a shift in our sensibility. Like, I remember when growth mindset came out,
Mhm.
right? And there was this, we're going to shift from this self-esteem based model of kids to this idea that you really should distress them some, right? That you should be trying to do things you're not good at. That's how, but it feels uncomfortable. But if you're just rewarding people for the skills they already have, then you're doing them a disservice that's going to lead to inadequacy and breakdown. And then, all the Nassim Taleb stuff that's come out over that same period of time of how do you grow through trauma? How do you become anti-fragile? How do you gain from stressors, things like that? There's a whole new way of thinking that has a lot in common with the Stoics and the best wisdom of our ancestors, but which hasn't been in the scientific and social discourse in the West for most of its history.
Yeah, I'm pretty very familiar with Carol Dweck's work, and the idea that if you praise someone for their identity as being a smart person, they will only do things that get rewarded with the identity. Whereas if you praise them for their effort, they'll start identifying with an effortful kind of mindset and
Yeah.
diverge from that. Um, and yeah, there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of good ideas out there that are just waiting to be applied, or connected, or
Yeah, and there'll
absorbed by
be,
our
and it's
culture.
also, that's part of the dharma, the practical dharma that we'll need if and when there's disruptions and changes in the system, right? Like, we don't know what kind of world the mid 21st century is going to look like. We do know it's going to be crazy in a variety of different ways. And how do you prepare for that unknown confluence of high level transformative factors? You have to be better at learning. You have to be better at suffering. You have to be better at making connections. You have to feel better when you're doing something you're not good at because you didn't know you were going to have to be good at it.
Yeah, the learning organization, by like all the science, is one of the best functioning paradigms in the world of organizations. It's better than specializing even on talent or a lot of other things. Like, the group that can use its resources to learn well handles the rate of change that the 21st century seems to have. I was talking to someone about, like, I always think of the computer like the car. Like, it went from horses to starting World War I when a car broke down, to suburban, and now it's kind of normalized and it's still doing interesting things, but the computer is kind of doing those similar disruptive and hard to predict patterns kind of every decade or something like that, that keep going, like, oh, I predicted the cell phone, but now where am I? um, so great. I don't want to take up any more of your time, Layman, and I just appreciate, this has been a great conversation.